students, the topic of our discussion today is gender relations in early medieval Indian society. We have with us today Dr. Vishnupriya Bashak, who will be talking to you on this issue, and Dr. Shayantani Pal and myself, Shuchandra Ghosh, will be participating in the discussion. So, Dr. Bashak, may I request you to please initiate the talk?
Hello students. Today we are going to talk about gender relations in early medieval Indian society. Now, any discussion on gender relations in early Indian society has to start with the Altaker paradigm, which Altaker basically wrote this very important work, The Position of Woman in Hindu Civilization, in 1938, and he wrote it in a basically nationalist context. Now, ever since then, this was definitely a seminal work, but ever since then there has been a lot of debates about the subject. Right. So, that is why this work is so important. It was the starting point of debate. Now, in this is a very, he gives a general survey of women, as you can make out in what he is saying, Hindu civilization. He is seeing women as basically passive recipients, their status and position being controlled by circumstances related to the patriarchal ideology. So, the position of women, institutions like marriage and family are basically seen as monolithic entity. Now, if we see in recent years, of course, we have another seminal work, that is B.N.S. Yadav's Society and Culture in Northern India. That was written in the 1970s, and later we have some discussion on this by Remarriage Chakraborty in one of his articles. Now, both of them we will see actually follow the Altaker paradigm in generating a homogenized understanding of gender relations of women. Basically, both of them see woman, the position of woman, as being controlled by patriarchal ideologies.
Regarding this homogenized understanding,
right?
So, could you please explain a little bit, because
the term. Why are we calling this a homogenized understanding? Now, we will see, like Remarriage Chakraborty is saying, that it is very difficult to find a prominent and honorable position for women in a patriarchal system and in a system which is controlled by the Jati Varna structure. In fact, he says that there is no scope for formal education of women. And here he is also ably supporting B.N.S. Yadav and quoting from various sources when he is saying that there was a tendency among lawgivers to reduce the age for marriage for women. And he is quoting, Remarriage Chakraborty is quoting Medatethi from his commentary, it is a 9th century work, commentary on Monu's Dharma Shastra, where Medatethi is saying that he is supporting the marriage of girls in the pre-puberty stage, that is the Nognika stage. So, you can make out that the kind of, the way they are trying to see woman and marriage. Then marriage was seen as they were, according to both Yadav and Chakraborty, society, especially the lawgivers, they were all for Shauborno marriage or the same caste marriage, and they were not so much for, they were not in support of the what they are saying, the adharma types of marriages. Why? Because that is bringing to the fore, these progenies who are resulting in these various Ontoja groups. Remarriage Chakraborty is in fact saying that, very interestingly, he is looking at this Nagarakhanda section of the Skanda Puran, and there he is saying, he is talking about these 2 more forms of marriage apart from those 8 forms, the Pratibha and the Ghaton. And this is possibly an indication of regional variation, because this section can be situated in Western India. So, we talk about regionalism in early medieval
its variation Indian. Was a very important thing in the early medieval society scenario.
So, this is how they are actually talking about a homogenized understanding of woman and family. Now, this is obviously bringing us to the next point, that is marriage considered as something indissoluble? So, we see that divorce or nullity of marriage, they were not considered. Only in exceptional circumstances like loss of husband, death, or renunciation or impotency of husband. Now, this brings us to another point, that is the remarriage of widows.
Yes. So what was the concept of remarriage?
Remarriage of widows. Now, Ranbir Chakravarti is mentioning this one term, that is punarbhu,
right,
which is meaning a widow who is remarried. Now, although this term is occurring, but what Chakravarti feels that possibly this was reprobated by the theorists, by the legal theorists. Why? Because this would have given rise to a lot of complications in property matters. And in fact, both of them, both Yadav and Chakravarti, they are mentioning the concept of niyoga. You know what niyoga is? Niyoga is basically the cohabitation of the widow with the brother of her late husband, if she does not have a progeny, for a male progeny.
Right. And I think this brings us to the question of the proprietary rights of the women.
Absolutely,
and
absolutely.
Here when we are talking about proprietary rights, it's very important, I think, to know that how much the girl progeny could
how
get,
much she could inherit.
should get.
That is a very important question actually, and that is what we are going to turn to in our next discussion. That is the proprietary rights of women, basically, how that determined gender relations. Now, basically at this time, during the early medieval period, we find two definite notions of property. One which is reflected in Jimutavahana's Daibhag, which was current in Bengal and generally in North India. And the other was Vignaneshwar's Mitakshara, which was basically a commentary on the Yajnavalkya Smritis. Right. Now, what about the proprietary rights of women? Jimutavahan, I mean, it is very categorically stated in Daibhag that the woman has every right to give, sell and enjoy her Stridhon. Stridhon basically means the gifts which are bestowed on the girl prior to her marriage by her parents, during her marriage by her husband and her in-laws, and after her marriage as well. And this is something that is considered to be her absolutely her own sort of thing. This is something over which the woman has a rightful claim and her full independence and freedom over this. In fact, Jimutvahan is saying that in any case where the woman is not leaving a will stating that where the Stridhon will go to, that will automatically go equally to the sons and the daughters. So, as far as Stridhon is concerned, there is no ambivalence as such, there is no contradiction as such. All the ambivalences and the contradictions that you are finding in the texts, also sometimes some kind of restrictions maybe, that is coming when one is talking about the daughter's or the wife's natural right to inherit the father's or the husband's property. Kattayan is mentioning that in case of a person who was sonless, in that case the widow, his widow, could inherit part of his property. Again, Jimudvan is saying that the widow, in case where there was no son, she could perhaps inherit a share of the joint family property. And Vignaneshwar is saying that the widow could absolutely claim the husband's movable property, not
quite
immovable.
Complex.
Not immovable. Now, Ramaswamy is saying that if we want to look at women in the grassroots, the marginalized groups, then we have to look beyond these texts and these texts, these texts which are talking about the upper class women and the sensitized social groups. And she says that you have to look for alternative sources. Which are these alternative sources? folk literature, songs. She has made use of a lot of these folk songs. Then occasional depiction in temple sculpture, and literary compositions of women saints like Andal, 7th century women saints like Andal. Now here, very interestingly, you are finding a wide range of economic activities, diverse categories of evidence of economic activities of different classes of women. Different classes means these marginalized groups of women. You see women engaged in agriculture, in pastoral economy, in spinning, weaving, in bleaching cloth, in pot making, in mat making, in goldsmithery, and various other things. Then you also find a representation of women as wage earners. Now the question is about the economic self-sufficiency of women. So here Ramaswamy is saying that if you look at these folk songs, etc., there was a patriarchal stranglehold over property of these marginalized classes of women. There was discrimination where it came to daily wage between the male and the female. Okay. Now another important domain that we can talk about in gender relations is the question of succession.
Yeah. Here I was just wondering, because we have some examples perhaps of patrilineal succession by women. So could you please elaborate on that?
Yeah, within the patrilineal system, what is happening is basically the the elder son is becoming is succeeding his father. Now, interestingly, we are finding. I will give you 3 instances, and they have been worked on very well. One is Raj Tarangini. This has been worked on by Kumkum Rai.
Right.
Then Cynthia Talbot's depiction of female Rudramma Devi, the female king, and the Orissa Bhaumakara dynasty, that has also been worked upon from this point of view.
Yeah.
You know, in both these, see, these are regionally very varied,
Right.
okay, geographically very distant. You have Kashmir, 10th century Kashmir, as depicted in Raj Tarangini. You have the Orissa Bhaumakara dynasty, 9th to 11th century, and here you have the Kakatiyas of Warangal, 13th century. Okay, we see a different line of succession, and that we cannot explain by the patrilineal system. You can only explain by a certain kind of bonding to kinship system and familial system. You want the succession of the throne to stay within the same kin relation. So therefore, when there was no male successor, therefore these women were
Powerful.
Were becoming important. So this is sort of deviation from the patrilineal mode that we usually encounter in these didactic texts, in most of these texts. So this is another domain which is which has been worked on and which is giving us new light on gender relations. Now another aspect is the question of reproduction.
Yes.
And biological reproduction, how that has been seen. In fact, Kumkum Rai herself has worked on this, and she's saying that we have to look at reproduction as a historical process, and not just the way women are depicted in literature, just as instruments of reproduction. So Kumkum Rai is looking at a larger context. Now when we are talking about reproduction, obviously then the next question would be, what was the nature of sexuality?
Yes.
Was it just determined by marriage or marital relationships, or there was a different dimension?
Yes, the other forms of sexuality.
Other forms, a different dimension of sexuality. So you see, the lawgivers, they are on the one hand, they are trying to reduce the marriageable age of women. On the other hand, an unmarried beautiful woman in full bloom of her youth, she is being portrayed in classical literature and Sanskrit literature, and often such an image is coinciding with the image of a gonika or prostitute. So this brings us to this very important institution on which a lot of work has been done in recent years, that is on the Vaishya, the Ganika or the prostitute. One of the foremost Marxist feminist historians of our time, that is Shukumari Bhattacharjee, and her very important work on prostitution. She makes a general survey of this institution and she tries to relate prostitution to the rise of urbanism. Now the Gonika and the Rupojiva, they had to be proficient in various arts and sciences. In fact, there's a Jain text of 6th century which is mentioning that they should be proficient in 72 types of arts and sciences. What are these? Starting from writing, arithmetic, verse making, singing, playing on musical instruments. Then she has to have proficiency in perfume making, fencing, trying to interpret.
She has to be a superwoman for
absolutely
that.
superwoman. Then she has to be able to interpret omens. So basically an icon of versatility. And which meant that she could demand, especially the Gonika, could demand a very high price. Now when we are coming to this economic aspect, we see that this is a text which is mentioned by many of these scholars, that is the Nammaya Sundari Katha, 12th century text, which is saying that the state's 25 to 30% of revenues is coming from the prostitutes. So you can imagine that they were
the economic importance
of this profession. And then we see that from there one would like to know what kind of proprietary rights they had. Now Bhattacharya is saying that perhaps the Gonika was full mistress of a property. But then there is another text called the Kuttani Mata, which is again a early medieval text. And that is talking about the plight of the prostitutes who in their old age, when they had nothing to fall back on, describes the plight of these classes of women. But perhaps institutionalized prostitution, where you find the Gonika, perhaps they escaped this plight. Then we also get to know about the household of the prostitute, basically where the mother reigned supreme. The mother was called Kuttani. Okay, then there were brothers, sisters, her sons and daughters, mostly perhaps illegitimate. And so this is the entire household. Then you had people like the Vitas, they are called Vita. They were basically the hangers-on, because they used to hang around the prostitute, and they did a lot of, they were very eloquent in their speech, etc. So this is the kind of household, a supportive structure in which the client stepped in. And the client basically, if there was any misbehavior on his part, he also had to pay some fines. So we get such instances.
That the fines are sanctioned by the state?
The state, in fact, yeah. I mean, it is there what Bhattacharya mentions, that it is given that he had to pay some fines, because you see, the more fines the client would pay, they would be the Gonika would the Gonika would get the wealth, and this would ultimately be siphoned off to the state. So this is the kind of picture that we are getting, and Sukumari Bhattacharya is saying that, in fact, this is one of the main premise, this is the chief premise of her work, that prostitutes were basically exploited by the patriarchal system. They were victims of the patriarchal system, that they had no option but to sell themselves. And generally they could choose their own customers, but they could not refuse if the king forced them to have a client. And all the didactic texts, they are full of contempt for the prostitute. In fact, some of them even went to the length of saying that murder of a prostitute is not considered to be a crime. All these texts are talking about her deceit. And at the same time, you find that in Rajtarangini you have King Lalitapita. He would befriend anyone who would be proficient in courtesan lore and clever at jokes. So you see, you also have this, what Sukumari Bhattacharya is saying, you also have this ambivalence in, as reflected in texts, that here was a woman who was giving a lot of revenue to the state, who again for whom there was a lot of contempt. At the same time, she was she sort of presented a vision of an alternate sexuality, to whom all these men flocked when they wanted to escape the drudgery of their marriage.
Mundane life.
So this is how Sukumari Bhattacharya is saying that, they are victims. Now, her work is raising a lot of possibilities of future research, is a very important work, and also perhaps there can be some, she has been questioned where her basic premise is concerned, especially by a young scholar called Shalini Shah. Shalini is saying that we cannot take the prostitute to be just a victim of the patriarchal system. In fact, she is saying, taking into consideration recent works on prostitution, many of them recent on the recent state of prostitution, 19th or 20th century. But taking cue from these works, she is saying that the Ganika, she is analyzing the classical Sanskrit literature from 7th to 13th century, and she is restricting her discussion to the Gonika who in return for sexual favors got money. So, she feels that the other categories that Bhattacharya is mentioning, she does not consider them to be part of the institutionalized prostitution. So, Shalini is saying that the Gonika, she could create a counterculture.
When she is using this word counterculture, what does she actually mean by it?
Yeah, what she means by counterculture is basically that the prostitute had her own independence, she had her own freedom, her own value systems by which she was creating her own space. So, in fact, what is interesting is she is using sometimes the same text that Sukumari Bhattacharya is using, just both of them are analyzing from different angles.
Okay.
So, you see this is the very tricky part about ancient texts, ancient Indian texts, that
how
there is,
the interpretation
varies, and there is there can be a lot of reading in between the lines and a lot of reading of the texts. So, she is saying that the kind of depiction that you have of the prostitutes in the literature, basically written by these male elite sections, that is their reaction to the freedom and the independence that the prostitute had. So, they were threatened. What Sukumari Bhattacharya is taking as the evidence of victimization, she is saying that this is a reaction to the prostitute's freedom and counterculture, that they were threatened by the kind of alternative sexuality that the prostitute was posing. And how she is talking about this counterculture, here she is focusing on the prostitute's household, where the mother reigned supreme. Then she is talking about the prostitute, how she was subversive, or how her culture was subversive of certain norms of patriarchal ideology.
So, she was wielding some kind of power.
Yeah, patriarchal ideology like childbirth, etc. Then how she dominated, how she could control her artha and dharma, okay, and which was very different from the Kulabodhu, and definitely the way she could project her sexuality, the way she could command, you know, her sexuality. And here one of the finest, I would say, expositions of prostitution, which both Bhattacharya and Shalini mention, is Shudraka's Mrityakartikam. Now, this text is basically slightly before our period, but the kind of depiction the way that you have about the relationship between Charudatto and Basanta Sena, I think that holds good for you know, what the Gonika Vritti was basically like. So, this I feel is a very interesting dimension of sexuality that we are getting. Now, I will just end with a few other areas of research which are, you know, redefining gender relations. One is the woman's sacred space, and here you have very interesting work again by Vijaya Ramaswamy in South India, where she is trying to see the woman's sacred space in Bhakti movement and in Virashaiva movement. And then another important area of research that Kumkum Roy is pointing out in her very enlightening discussion that she is giving in her editorial in Woman and Woman in Early Indian Society, where she is talking about the multiple manifestations of the goddess. And she is saying that there is a lot of work on this, and there is a lot of study of these goddess cult, but the problem is when in some of the studies there is a tendency to equate the divine with the human. So, one has to be careful in that. So with this, I think we can end today's discussion, and I would just like to, just to sum up, I would just like to highlight the important point that we started with Altaker.
Yeah.
So you can make out that it is very difficult to just think of woman per se. You know, woman, family, then marriage, none of these are monolithic categories. We have to think of regional variations. We have to go beyond a homogenized understanding when we are talking about gender relations in any part, any time, especially in the early medieval Indian society.
Thank you very much, Dr. Boshak, for your wonderful exposition. And now we know that how the Altakarian paradigm has been critiqued and reconsidered also by some scholars. Thanks a lot.
Thanks to both of you for wonderful interventions, and I hope the students have benefited.
Sure.